Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference. At that time, you may press star, then the number 1 on your phone to ask a question. I would like to inform all parties that today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the conference over to Melissa Grasso. Thank you. You may begin.
Great. Thank you so much, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. We'd like to welcome you to our webinar on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, 2 views on anti-corruption. I know some of you have joined us for our previous webinars as part of the 101 series. I wanted to make a note that we included this webinar as part of both the 101 and 201 series because FCPA compliance is a topic that individuals really need to be cognizant of and vigilant about, no matter their level of expertise in the export compliance field. So glad that you all have joined us for the webinar today. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I just wanted to highlight who we are at the U.S. Commercial Service. We are the trade promotion arm of the U.S. Department of Commerce, so we work with companies throughout the United States to help them to develop and execute international business plans. We have offices throughout the U.S. and at U.S. embassies and consulates in about 75 countries. So definitely encourage you to visit our website, which is www.export.gov, where you can find your local office. And again, we have a whole host of webinars coming up throughout the summer. This is a list of the webinars coming up in the coming weeks, so definitely encourage you to register for those if you haven't already. One quick note before I introduce our speakers, and that is that while we're exceptionally pleased to be hosting the webinar, the speakers' views are their own, and they're not the views of the U.S. Department of Commerce nor the U.S. government, nor does our hosting this webinar constitute U.S. Department of Commerce or U.S. government endorsement of their views. With that said, I'll provide a brief introduction of both of our speakers and definitely encourage everyone on the call to take a closer look at both of our speakers' bios as they both have very interesting backgrounds. So we'll start with Ross Garber. Ross is a partner at the Connecticut-based law firm Shipman and Goodwin. He co-chairs the firm's government investigations and white-collar crime group, and he also oversees the firm's international trade practice. In the international trade practice, Ross oversees a team that helps U.S. exporters to navigate the complex and challenging regulatory environment so that they can expand their sales abroad. Of important note, in 2015, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce presented Ross and his team from Shipman and Goodwin with the President's E Award for their work in growing U.S. exports, and this really is a great honor to receive the President's E Award. And our first speaker for today is Richard Bistrong, who is the CEO of Frontline Anti-Bribery, LLC. Richard has spent much of his career as an international sales executive and currently consults and speaks on foreign bribery, ethics, and compliance issues from that frontline perspective. Richard was the Vice President of International Sales for a large publicly traded manufacturer of police and military equipment, which included residing and working in the UK. And in 2007, as part of a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice and subsequent immunity from prosecution in the UK, Richard assisted the U.S., UK, and other governments in their understanding of how FCPA, bribery, and other export violations occurred and operated in international sales. In 2012, Richard was sentenced as part of his own plea agreement and served 14 and a half months at a federal prison camp, returning home in December 2013. And currently, Richard consults, writes, and speaks about current frontline anti-bribery and compliance issues. Again, we'll be sending out the bios. I encourage you folks to take a closer look at both of our speakers' bios. And with that, Richard, I will pass the presenter role to you, and thank you both again for joining us. Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Melissa, for the introduction, and to the U.S. Commercial Service for this opportunity to share my story this morning. And it's always a pleasure to engage on a panel with Ross Garber, where we can talk about 2 different perspectives of this very important issue. So, Melissa, I'm having a problem going to the next slide. Hello?
I just moved it for you. You should have control, Richard.
I do, but the arrow is not letting me. So Do you want to advance?
I'm happy to advance them for you.
Thank
no problem.
Thank you so much. Okay, right now what I still see is the welcome slide.
Yep, we've actually moved on to how good people make bad decisions.
Melissa,
Okay.
Richard still has the control of the slide. So, Richard, if you click on your name at the top, that will take you to your presentation.
Okay. My name. And I've done that. And apologies here, I am clicking. I don't want my video, so I'm just still seeing the welcome slide, that's it.
And Richard, you want to exit the video because we can now see you.
I thought I did. Do you still see the video?
Yes, I can still see the video. Operator, how can Richard exit out of the video?
I believe if you see the camera to the right of your name within the panelists, I think if you click on that, that will disable your video.
Okay, so now I can see the slide. And now
And we can still see you, Richard, so if you could click on that.
Can you disable the video? Because I don't seem to be able to. I'm sorry.
One moment.
Sorry about this.
No worries. Okay, Richard, the video is gone, so we can just see your presentation now.
Okay. So I see the first slide, but again, I'm not able to advance. There we go. How good people make bad decisions. Do we see that?
Yes, we are all set.
Okay,
on
good.
That slide. Thanks, Richard.
Now that we've gone through the technical hurdles, that's what we're going to talk about today, is how people make bad decisions. And this is a quote from an attorney who's a friend of mine, Scott Killingsworth. When we start down the path of misconduct, the first person we deceive is usually ourselves. So I'd like for today's attendees to sort of think about that in the background as we go through this story together. So why talk about the dark side? As Melissa shared in the introduction, I ended up going to federal prison for violating the FCPA. That is certainly the dark side. And I hope that as we go through this, and I'm sure I don't need to convince today's attendees that corruption and fraud are serious challenges in our global commercial environment, and they're not going away. And that this issue of the FCPA and anti-corruption, it involves and impacts well-educated and well-compensated professionals. So I hope that today, as we go through this story together, that you will be able to identify opportunities through this real-world story about how to build good ethics and compliance practices, not only into your compliance processes, but into your business processes and operations. Because while these are compliance issues, these are certainly business challenges and leadership challenges. So I'll ask, and I hope this opens up the floor to questions at the end, are your teams embracing or discarding anti-bribery compliance in the field to the needs of business growth? And is integrity and ethics guiding your teams wherever they work and wherever they go? So briefly about myself, I did not want to be an international sales vice president when I grew up. After finishing undergraduate school at the University of Rochester, I entered the Woodrow Wilson School of Government at the University of Virginia in their PhD Foreign Affairs program. So right around 1987, after I received my master's degree, I turned down a White House foreign policy internship, which I'm sure you can imagine is a coveted prize for a young grad student, to enter what was a family business started by my great-grandfather, manufacturing what we often call bulletproof vests. And I would spend the next 10 years, and this will become relevant, I think, a little bit later, focusing on the U.S. law enforcement and U.S. military marketplaces. Those are well-organized markets with a very experienced, organized civil service procurement, and what we would consider to be high integrity and low risk markets. So that's sort of where I grew up in the sales field, mostly in my family business, but then also I moved over to a large, growing, and very successful publicly traded manufacturer in the aerospace and defense field. This was a company that had a very wide portfolio of products, not just bulletproof vests, but armored vehicles, munitions, riot control equipment. It was a very exciting company, and in 1997, they were going to do what you see a lot of businesses do. They wanted to invest in lucrative overseas markets, and I thought they were going to go hire an international sales vice president, and I was thinking, well, that's the job for me, right? I had a good education and graduate level degree in foreign policy, along with accumulated sales success in the U.S. markets. So using my best sales skills, I convinced the company to give me that role or to trust me with that role, and I would spend the next 10 years working all over the world. I was overseas an average of 250 days a year, and as Melissa mentioned, part of that time I would work and reside out of the United Kingdom. So why relive the past? Why am I here at the invitation of the U.S. Commercial Service telling a story about criminal conduct? That certainly isn't what I thought I'd be doing when I was a young grad student at the University of Virginia. So here's a picture of why I do it. There I am finishing the London Marathon, probably around 2008, feeling very good, very healthy. And there I am just 2 months out of federal prison. 14 months of incarceration had enormous health impact. I walked into prison, that healthy marathon runner, and what was a small cholesterol problem in my life that I always controlled through obsessive running and diet blew out into full-blown coronary heart disease in just 14 and a half months, and I found myself undergoing an emergency heart procedure 2 months out of prison. And this is a self-inflicted wound, and it was totally avoidable, and it's not something I want to see anyone else ever have to go through. So what I do is I try to help companies keep people safe, because in a global workforce and a dispersed workforce, an organization is only as strong as each individual. So if you're keeping people safe and they're making good decisions, they're going to keep the company safe. Because the benefit of crime for the individual who might game the system for his or her own benefit is nothing compared to the costs of crime to the company in terms of reputation, reputational damage, the cost of internal investigations, regulatory fines. But what about the unintended consequences of bribery? What about its impact on economic development, global security, and health and welfare? So I try to look at this issue and encourage organizations to look at this issue as much more than just a law. And just really quickly, I think this is, I call it the slide to the obvious, is that, you know, the risk when it comes to foreign bribery is not at the level of the regulators or the C-suite or the top end of an org chart where these rules, policies, and procedures get rolled out. The risk is at the front line, far away from home, where people work awfully thinly managed and supervised, and a lot of your better salespeople might have a little bit of risk-taking in their DNA. That's where the danger is. That's where the challenge is. And I think we should remind ourselves that the goal of people in a workforce, particularly your frontline personnel, their job is to grow the business, to execute on their commercial objectives, while at the same time we want to drive and execute compliant legal, and ethical behavior. And I don't think that happens on its own. I think it needs a little bit of attention. So that's sort of the end of the academic part of this discussion, and let's talk about a real-world story. So before I take my first flight, a couple of things happen. Number one, my former employer provides me with a copy of the FCPA, and they said, Richard, this is the law. It's going to govern your conduct. Take your time and read it. And if you have any questions, we'll get your resources to help you. I didn't need those resources. I understood that bribing or conspiring to bribe a foreign official to gain or retain business was against U.S. law. And what I was going to do in my route to market, which we still see today, was to grow a network of third parties and intermediaries, throughout the world. I didn't have the budget for a direct workforce, so I was going to grow these independent agents. And there it is. I find myself with one in a place called Tierra del Fuego. Tierra del Fuego is the bottom tip of Argentina. I think it's the southernmost habitable city on earth. And this particular agent I had done a few small deals with. I had no indication of corruption or corrupt intent. This wasn't a bagman. This is not somebody that you would see on a Panama paper database. He had an account in his name in his country, and I was there to talk about a large upcoming tender. And over, I think it may have been coffee or lunch, as we're talking about this future sales opportunity, he shares with me that he's paying tolls to win tenders. And in the next 15 years, I would hear some really interesting words to describe a foreign bribe. In this case, he called them tolls. I've heard them called making people happy, taking care of people, special market information. I recently read about one where they were called chocolates and another one where they were sunshine payments. The only word I never heard used to describe a foreign bribe was bribe. And what was interesting about this conversation, also relevant for today's challenges, is as I shared before, this person wasn't a bagman. He was providing legitimate business services, helping me to identify market opportunities, doing translations, introducing me to end users for technical presentations, all of the things that you would want a legitimate business partner to do. But he was paying tolls when he needed to pay tolls. And the other thing that's interesting about this conversation is he didn't ask me for anything. He wasn't sharing the need to pay tolls to sort of leverage up how much success fee he was getting, because most intermediaries are paid on a success fee basis. He wasn't saying there are a lot of toll takers, so we need to up my commission. He was just sharing, this is how things get done around here. And over the next few years, I would hear these conversations, and many different colorful words play themselves out in region after region. So what did I do? I just figured, well, this is only a red flag if I make it one. And I just nodded my head. And as Ross Garber will share later on, just the promise to pay a bribe is a violation of U.S. law. So right there, I was a co-conspirator to violating U.S. law. And I did not go to prison for just nodding my head, I can assure you that. But when I'm asked, Richard, between graduate school and federal prison, where did it go wrong or where did it start to go wrong? For the most part, it was in places like Tierra del Fuego. So the next slide is a little bit about what I call my perfect storm, how I rationalize bribery, that I thought of as something with low risk and high rewards. And I'm going to go through these rather quickly, but I think it gives you an idea as to what was I thinking. So the first thing I was thinking when my family asked that question to me after I got caught, when my defense attorney asked me that question, well, I wasn't thinking I was going to get caught. And looking out at the Antarctic tundra in places like Tierra del Fuego and the Dead Sea in Jordan and Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, I wasn't thinking I was in the earshot of international law enforcement. And I certainly wasn't thinking I was in the earshot of my company's compliance personnel. And in social psychology theory, they call that optimism bias, where you think the chances of you getting caught are less than the chances of anyone else getting caught. And the worst part about that is the longer you're not caught, the more you think you're not going to get caught. And the next cloud, so to speak, is my incentive compensation. I had an aggressive set of commercial objectives and a very lucrative, what we call eat what you kill incentive plan based on personal performance. So in many parts of the world where the institutions of state were weak, where procurement personnel were poorly trained, inadequately compensated, and the rules of procurement are absolutely marked by secrecy, a lack of transparency, I'm starting to think in some of these places, what does the company really want? Success or compliance? Because I started to think of them as a zero-sum game, and I didn't think I could achieve my commercial objectives and adhering to that FCPA policy that I signed. I didn't think I could do both. And as I pondered what does the company really want, regrettably to me, I never called the company and asked, what do you really want, success or compliance? That was a debate that I kept to myself. And for me, the paycheck always won. But I'd like to make clear and take a little pause here. This isn't a webinar in ethical spinning. No one pressured me to break the law. There's only one person that's responsible for Richard Bistrong going to prison, and that's Richard Bistrong. Cheating was a choice, and I wasn't a fall guy. This crucible is no one else's fault but my own. But hopefully, with that said, as I share with you some of these rationalizations and temptations, they help you with the real-world risk that forward teams face, particularly in these regions that we're talking about where local culture might appear to conflict with the rules. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit later because there is a normal, and I think it can be a healthy tension between commercial objectives, incentives, and compliance, but it doesn't mean that it has to be untangled with people working far away from home on their own the way I did, where I took those compliance decisions into my hands. And we often think of bribery as grand corruption, some minister siphoning off natural resources into an offshore account for his or her own benefit. But particularly in some marketplaces and in some particular product and services that have complex sales and delivery cycles, your risk can go higher and begin when your goods and services hit the foreign shores, where every stamp, every signature, whether it's from an inspection committee or customs clearance or a national bank, is an excuse for some poorly paid public official to ransom your entire contract for what we might think of as a small bribe. So just don't always think about bribery in its grand scale. Think about those smaller processes that could expose you to foreign risk once your goods have been delivered. And there's another social psychology theory called loss aversion, and it talks about how we will take greater risk not to lose something than to win something. So think about your commercial workforce, and are they in a position where they're bribing just not to lose a contract that's already been delivered? So as I shared before, at some point I just started to think of, okay, I get it. This is how international business works. And when I would meet up with peers and competitors at international trade fairs all over the world, or maybe we'd bump into each other at a hotel or a restaurant, we're swapping war stories. Who's paying who? Sometimes we're even comparing the percentage of a commission that we thought was the bribe. So we're swapping these corrupt stories in these different countries, and it certainly had an impact on my thinking of, well, if I don't do this, certainly someone else will. And I started to what one social psychologist called I was in the cocoon of corruption. I started to trust my intermediaries and third parties because we knew how to get things done in these high-risk regions. And the people at headquarters, the people that were there to see me successful and safe, I started to distrust them. I thought, they don't know what it's like to work out here. And I started becoming the ambassador of my intermediaries and third parties instead of the ambassador of my former employer. And recently, I just got back from an anti-corruption event in Oslo, and someone asked if I was losing any sleep over the course of this 10 years. Regrettably, the answer is no. I wasn't thinking about the ethical consequences of my decisions. I wasn't thinking I was harming anyone. I wasn't spending my nights on the Transparency International website thinking about how even petty corruption robs societies of governance, human rights, economic development, and social welfare. I'm looking at it at the business level of who's getting hurt here. I'm not pulling layers out of a bulletproof vest. So the end user's getting a world-class brand at a good price. There was one case I pleaded guilty to for bribing a UN official, and the United Nations paid even less money for the product because I was able to see through corruptly obtained information what the competitors were charging. So I'm thinking the company gets the sale. They might even have to add a second shift to manufacture the order. I make my quota, my bonus, my forecast. The intermediary moves on to the next deal, and that poorly paid public official might get a little something to make ends meet. So from nice inner city hotels and business class lounges, I was thinking of it as a win-win, and I was ethically numb to my decisions. I even thought of it as altruistic. Okay. So there I am back in Tierra del Fuego, nodding my way to prison. And I'm thinking, why should I care? Like I said, who am I hurting? And a friend of mine works for a global development bank, and they sold a number of radiant baby warmers to a hospital in India. And they went ahead and they paid an on-site visit to go audit the multi-million-dollar project for providing these state-of-the-art radiant baby warmers, and that's what was there when they showed up. So through what should have been state-of-the-art of equipment, through corruption, the hospital doctors ended up improvising this device to keep these babies warm. That's what corruption looks like on the front lines. Okay, and be careful because, and I'm sure Mr. Garber will talk about this, there's high-risk regions and low-risk regions, but we should always ask ourselves, is there a no-risk region? And there is a newspaper article about me because I conspired to bribe a Dutch police officer to win a law enforcement contract. So I doubt that anyone who's joining us today would ever think of the Dutch police as a high-risk customer in terms of corruption risk. So be careful about what you might think of as no risk. And again, as I'm sure Mr. Garber will talk about, the third parties, intermediaries, are often the Achilles heel of a compliance program, and third parties can really put you in harm's way. So while you're trying to investigate your third parties to verify and audit what they might tell you, or if they do self-assessments, the information they provide you, you might try to assess and mitigate the risk that they might present to your company, because I call that the circle of trust, and you just don't want to let anyone in there. And just going around this circle here, I think you have to be careful, because while Western multinationals spend a lot of time trying to understand and assess and mitigate third-party risk, not everybody shares our concerns. And for many third parties and intermediaries all over the world, they might not take this as seriously as we do. I heard everything from Western anti-bribery laws are almost colonial, they're trying to impose a set of standards here in our country where they don't belong. Gift giving, is a sort of cultural way of life. It's been in our society for generations. There's no prosecutorial resources here. It's just tolerated, even by law enforcement, all the way to it's legal here. But be careful. Those same third parties, if you put anti-corruption paperwork for them to sign, that they will respect and embrace the law, and this should be one of these keep you up at night moments, they will sign that paperwork. Because they don't take it seriously, if all that stands between them and doing business with a Western or globally recognized brand is signing anti-corruption paperwork, they're happy to do it. And let's just remember that even with the most robust due diligence, all that is a snapshot of where that third party might stand on the continuum of corruption at that particular time. And I have seen third parties and intermediaries go from almost 100% legitimate to 100% corrupt because of regime change, where a new president that puts in new ministers and new people in procurement might change the relationships that third party has with government officials. So always be careful about vetting and forgetting, and remember that corruption risk is fluid. It lives and changes over the life of a relationship. And always make yourself sort of diligent and aware about the atmospherics of transactions. I know we live in a very data-rich and analytical world, but do you ever look at the atmospherics of transactions and just ask, does this look right? I once received an order for a substantial amount, hundreds of thousands of dollars, of explosive grenades for a small Caribbean island that had no public safety or defense need. That order came in at full price, where if they would have asked for a discount, they would have gotten one. And that order sailed through compliance, it sailed through finance. It even had to get licensed by the State Department because it was an ITAR-controlled munition. So no red flags were identified in that order. There was only one problem with it. It was a red flag. It was for product that the country didn't need in quantities that were disproportionate even for a small training requirement and prices that were higher than the market would have demanded. So something that looks too good might be too good, and do you just ever hit the pause button and ask questions about how did this order develop? Why are we getting it? What are the elements of it? And it's never too late to ask those questions. And I always encourage you, just be careful with your forward-based teams. I started to spend way too much time on the road. What was I doing in Tierra del Fuego over a weekend when I could have been with my family and my young children? I got too close to my intermediaries, and I started to become their ambassadors instead of my former employer. And I think if you're not careful, and I've only talked about 4 elements here, a corrupt third party can get into that circle of trust. So I really thank you for your time, and I ask you, is everybody talking about risk together? Well, foreign bribery, the FCPA, anti-bribery laws and conventions, yes, they are compliance and legal challenges, but it requires leadership. Leadership to make sure that commercial objectives don't run away from market reality. Leadership to ensure that people's incentive systems are promoting ethical conduct and sustainable business practices and not pointing toward risky and risk-taking behavior. That's a business discussion. That's not a compliance discussion. And that's where everyone, from business development to finance, audit, compliance, and those folks in your commercial teams and operations, everybody needs to be talking about that risk together. And 58% of chief compliance officers in a recent study responded that they're not. And the reason for that knife is it's a falling knife. And I think for compliance leaders, if your organization is not having risk talked about in the context of business and operations, the compliance is left to catch those falling knives later on. So that's the end of my presentation. Sorry about the rocky technical start, but I hope to some extent you might have learned how to pay a bribe. That's the Trace International book, How to Pay a Bribe, of which I was happy to contribute a chapter. There's some of my contact information. And again, with apologies at the rocky technical start, I'm happy to turn it back over to Melissa and to Mr. Garber.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. I know we've had you present at a couple programs, and I always find it equally as fascinating every time I hear you present, and it's great to hear your perspective. So thank you again. And operator, can you remind folks how they can enter an audio question?
Absolutely. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, please press *1, unmute your phone, and record your name clearly. Your name is required to introduce your question. If you need to withdraw your question, please press *2. Again, to ask a question, press *1. It will take a moment for questions to come through. Please stand by.
And while we wait for the first question, I'll just give a quick reminder that if you don't want to ask a question over the telephone, you can enter a written question in the queue that's on the bottom right-hand side of your screen.
I'm showing no questions over the phone at this time.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Just to remind everyone, we will have another Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to ask Richard any questions at that point. Now I'd like to turn things over to Ross Garber, who's going to dig in a little bit more to the definition and some of the nuances of the FCPA regulations. Ross, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Melissa, and thanks, Richard. And I want to emphasize, Richard and I are sort of unusual presenters for this kind of program. If you've sort of been through one of these things before, usually you get the perspective of sort of a long-time career compliance professional, which is great. Richard is obviously not that. I'll also confess that I'm not that. I am a defense lawyer. I represent people in Richard's former position, people who've been suspected or accused of FCPA violations. I also, though, represent companies, and I do investigations of potential FCPA issues. Either way, you probably don't want to have to see me, but if you do, that's sort of my perspective, and it's from that perspective that I want to talk about the FCPA, because it is a little bit different than sort of, I think, your normal compliance professional. I think you've heard that Richard sort of sees that world a little bit differently. So do I, because one way or the other, I wind up sitting across the table from a lot of people who are surprised to be there. Sometimes in writings and in trainings, it seems, very obvious how we wind up getting in trouble in this area. I'm here to tell you that it's not always that obvious. And one of the things I want to do today is sort of flag some of the key issues. And as Melissa noted, at the end, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions, and also if there are questions for Richard, we can do that. So you heard about the reality of doing business from Richard. I want to also talk about now sort of what the FCPA is. And generally, there is a criminal component to it and also a civil component. The criminal component addresses offering or providing anything of value to a foreign official with the intent to obtain or retain business. If that sounds straightforward to you, the rest of my presentation will make clear that almost none of those words mean what the average person might think they mean. So I'm going to drill down into it. There's also a civil component that's enforced by the Securities and Exchange Commission relating to maintaining accurate books and records and maintaining an adequate system of controls. But it all boils down to what these terms mean. Now, one thing that you'll often hear in presentations is not prohibited, and I'm not going to talk much about it, is facilitating or expediting payments. One of the reasons I'm not going to talk much about it is if I find in my world, if you're asking the question about what that is and whether it might qualify as an FCPA violation or it might not, you're already in the soup. And so my general advice, even though I can't give any of you advice because you're not my clients, but my general advice is you don't go near that kind of stuff. One, because it gets very close to the line. Two, is because it is prohibited in lots of other places. So my general rule is stay away from facilitating or expediting payments. So now let's drill down into what we're talking about here. So the first terms we talked about are offering or providing. Now, as Richard mentioned, a bribe doesn't have to succeed, and as we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, I know the folks on this line. I know you aren't going to be handing over cash to somebody. I know that, and so that's not what this is about. This is about people who are trying to do the right thing and working with people who they believe are trying to do the right thing, dealing with situations that might be on the margin. And so one thing with respect to this is to emphasize that a bribe, to be a violation, for there to be a violation of the FCPA, a bribe need not succeed. Even the offer, even the promise of a payment, even the authorization of a payment is enough. And the failure of a bribe to be paid is not a defense. That doesn't work. So you're offering or providing what? Something of value. Now, it is true sometimes it's cash. Sometimes it is cash. But it doesn't have to be cash. And usually, in my experience, we're not talking about cash. We're talking about something else of value. And it can be a whole host of things. And I list some of these things here. You think about what might be of value to a foreign official. Travel or entertainment, a loan on favorable terms, a contribution to their favorite charity, a contribution to their political party, some sort of discount on goods or services, giving scholarships to their kids or their nephews or their relatives, some rebates or commissions, overpayments, job offers, investments. These are all things that you've seen out in the world have been things of value that have gotten people tripped up in FCPA cases. This is not an exhaustive list. So it can be really anything of value. We're not just talking about suitcases full of cash. So who would the offer or payment be made to? Well, for it to be an FCPA violation, it's a foreign official. The definition of foreign official also is not always clear. So yes, sometimes it's an officer or an employee of the government. It's Richard's police officer in I forget where it was, the Netherlands or someplace like that, or somebody who's wearing a uniform. All right, that is an officer or an employee of government. Somebody with a fancy government title, sure. It could also be, though, a political party or a party official. It could also be a candidate for office or an officer or an employee of some public international organization. I think Richard referred to that. Or, and this piece is important, or an officer or an employee of an instrumentality of a foreign government. Now, what is an instrumentality of a foreign government? Well, it's somebody who's who's acting in some capacity for the government. And in some parts of the world, businesses are essentially either owned or operated by the government. Think about China. Think about much of the Middle East. Think about Russia and some other places in Eastern Europe. There are lots of places in the world where you walk into an office, it seems like it's a business office, but really that business is owned or controlled in some way by the government. And if that's the case, that implicates the FCPA. And so in some businesses, probably some of these folks on the line, you have checklists or evaluation schematics to sort of figure out who you're dealing with. Are you dealing with the government, or are you dealing with a truly private party? And sometimes, I will tell you, it gets complicated. You look at the extent of government ownership, you look at the extent of the government's control over the operation, how the government characterizes the entity. I won't go through this whole list, but I'll tell you that sometimes it gets very nuanced and very tricky. And so, the fact that somebody looks like they're employed by something that looks like a private company doesn't mean payments can be made to them or on their behalf and that you're avoiding the FCPA. It just means you've got to look at, look more closely at who you're dealing with and the kind of company and entity that you're dealing with. This is a point that was made, or at least raised, by Richard. Probably the most important thing to think about, especially, again, for the people on this call who aren't carrying around briefcases full of cash to give to people, is that the FCPA also addresses payments, bribes, paid by others. Richard was talking about, the fact that he's at the front line, or he was at the front line. He was the person interacting with the foreign officials. Well, that doesn't mean that everybody else in the organization is off the hook because they're not the ones making the payments. It doesn't mean that the organization is off the hook. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. So even though the FCPA, the statute, requires knowledge of a payment made by a third party, it doesn't mean that you all sitting in your offices in San Francisco or New York or Massachusetts or Connecticut or wherever you are, you're off the hook if you didn't see the bribe being paid, if you didn't hear the words being spoken. That doesn't mean that you and your colleagues are off the hook, because even though the statute requires knowledge for culpability, for a conviction, again, knowledge in this context doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. Knowledge can be inferred if somebody is found to be putting their head in the sand or avoiding red flags. In other words, avoiding knowing the truth. And one of the things I like to mention is this jury instruction from a case in the Second Circuit, where the jury was told by the judge that in this prosecution for an FCPA violation, that knowledge may be established when a person is aware of a high probability of its existence and consciously and intentionally avoided confirming that fact. So when one of your people or you hear about a potential issue or hear about something squirrely going on, that is going to be the question. Is were you aware of a high probability of its existence, and consciously and intentionally avoided confirming that fact. And these things are always viewed in hindsight. They're viewed months, years later. They're viewed after an investigation, and it becomes much tougher to defend against then. Things appear more clear, as you know, in hindsight than they actually are. And so in this case, a juror remarked that they found that the person had that requisite knowledge, that conscious avoidance, because that person was dealing in Azerbaijan, which is a foreign country. And they thought that the defendant knew about the bribery and definitely could have known, because he's an investor and it's his job to know. You and your people don't want to be on the other end of that kind of discussion. So another component of the FCPA is that the payment or the offer to pay or to compensate has to be with the intent to obtain or attain business. And there we're talking about winning a contract. If somebody's making a payment or offering a thing of value to a government official in exchange for winning a contract, well, that's an intent to obtain or retain business. It could also be influencing the procurement process, or circumventing import rules, or gaining access to non-public bid tender information. So it's not just directly getting the contract. It can also be these other more nuanced things, even evading taxes or penalties, or influencing the adjudication of lawsuits, or getting some sort of exception to a regulatory requirement, or avoiding contract termination. And again, these are issues that are going to be sorted out in hindsight. So this intent to obtain or retain business is something that can be quite broad. And in the context of all that, probably the most important thing you can do is pay attention to potential red flags. Pay attention to them and then act on them. And again, these things are going to be viewed as red flags in hindsight. So you want to pay attention to things like this sort of upfront, like, a situation where the commission is substantially above going rate. Are you paying to some sort of third party, an intermediary, a rep, somebody like that, a very, very high commission? Well, in hindsight, you know what that's going to look like if part of that commission was forwarded on by that sales rep to somebody who shouldn't have gotten it. It's going to look like, well, you knew or should have known, or your people knew or should have known. Why were you paying a commission that was so out of whack? And that's something that comes up in a lot of cases, is they look at the amount of commission being paid to a third party or a sales rep. An unusual payment mechanism. Is the money being routed in an odd way? Request that the check be made payable to cash or bearers. The money traveling through some sort of third party or third country. Is it clear what the invoice is for? Things like that. And as Richard alluded to, you want to be particularly careful and look at these red flags in light of practices where in the countries in which you're working or your people are working. For example, standards in China might be different than standards in Western Europe. Standards in Sub-Saharan Africa might be different than standards in Canada. And so you want to take the place into account. One issue we see a lot is for travel expenses. Some official is interested in coming to the United States, and this comes up a lot, or is interested in going someplace else and wants you to foot the bill for them. Well, it's one thing if it's a reasonable and bona fide travel expense, meaning expenses directly related to the promotion, demonstration, or explanation of products or services, or expenses directly related to the execution or performance of a contract. But if what's really happening is that official is interested in traveling for pleasure, or spending extra days for pleasure and wants you to pick up the tab for that, that is another matter, and that becomes a problem. And this comes up, all the time. And so one of the things we advise very strongly is looking closely at travel for foreign officials or people who could be considered foreign officials, so that you're only paying for actual business-related travel, that you're not paying for extra days tacked on at the beginning or the end, that you're paying the cost of the travel directly to the vendor. You're not paying the foreign official and trusting that those funds are being used for travel. You're not using cash to pay for travel. You require receipts. You think about the reasonableness of the travel. Things like that. You want to look very carefully at travel-related expenses. So that's sort of the setup of the FCPA. How do you avoid problems? Well, you have an ethics code. You train to that code. You make sure the people who need to get training. You have regular audits, and I'm going to talk about a couple of these things now. You do diligence on proposed mergers and acquisitions. You investigate red flags and tips. You look into things when things don't look right or when they don't pass the smell test. And if there's a law enforcement inquiry about a potential FCPA issue, you look closely at that and respond appropriately. One of the first things I find law enforcement officials look at, and regulators, is whether you have an effective compliance program. That things can be happening out in the field. The question for the organization is, did you have an effective compliance program? In other words, did you do what you could do to prevent the problem? And law enforcement looks at a framework, a general framework for an effective compliance program. One is it tailored to your business? Did you download it off of the internet or use some other business's ethics program, or did you give thought to it and tailor it? Does it include the government standards, what they think of as important issues? Does it contemplate things that people have gotten in trouble under the FCPA for? In other words, other FCPA prosecutions. Does it evaluate and address your own company's risks and your own industry's risks? If you're doing precious metal business in sub-Saharan Africa, you're going to want to and need to address different issues than if you're selling hamburgers in Canada. And so you want to look at the industry risks. You're going to have to look at the country risks, and usually on these things, because the stakes are high, you want to consult with counsel. One, to make sure you get it right, and two, in some ways, you got somebody to point to and even potentially blame. But really, you want to make sure you get it right. And so, depending on what kind of business you're in, you want to make sure you get the appropriate legal advice. You want to have an ethics manual, and again, law enforcement regulators will usually ask to see it. They'll want to see that it's clear and that it's straightforward, that it's regularly reviewed and updated. And I will tell you that having an ethics manual on the shelf, and I've heard this from lots of regulators and law enforcement officials, having an ethics manual on the shelf that you haven't looked at, that you haven't updated, is probably worse than not having one at all, because those are the standards that you're going to be judged by and held to. You want to have the manual distributed to the people who need to get it, and you want to make sure it's tailored to your local laws and practices and risks. With respect to the FCPA, you want to make sure that you're explaining the FCPA in clear language and other anti-bribery statutes. That in the manual itself, you identify key risk areas. For example, travel is a big one, and many, if not most, if not all of the ethics codes I see specifically address travel issues. You want to tell people in the organization what's permissible and what's not permissible. You want to tell them when they need documentation and when they don't need documentation. For example, business expenses, dinners, when you need documentation, when don't you? You need to identify when approval's needed. Can somebody out in the field, like Richard used to be, get his or her hands on, $50,000 in cash or otherwise to pay somebody, or in what situations do they need to go up the chain? Usually, and I say usually, probably always, you want to have guidelines for gifts, circumstances and monetary amounts. You want to have guidelines for meals and entertainment, for travel, for donations and lobbying. You also want to make sure that in the ethics manual it's clear what an employee should do if they suspect that there's a problem. In other words, a hotline. Here's a number to call if you suspect that something is going awry. Depending on the size of your organization, some organizations have confidential ombuds people to receive those issues. But it's something that you want to think about and make sure, for a lot of reasons, that an employee knows where to go if they think there's a problem. Regulators and law enforcement are also going to look at your internal controls. They're going to look at your controls of cash, your general accounting and financial controls, your record keeping, how duties are divided among the people in your accounting department and your finance department, what kind of documentation is required in the real world, not just in your ethics code, but in the real world, what kind of documentation is required and what kind of authorization is required. And this is, again, to get at this notion of, how easy or hard is it for somebody in your, foreign sales force, third party, somebody in a position to make an improper payment, how hard is it or easy is it for them to get their hands on the cash to do that and make the payment without somebody in the home office or otherwise knowing in time to stop it or address the problem. You also want to make sure your employees are trained about what's expected of them. Again, having an ethics code on your shelf is, in some cases, counterproductive if you're not going to make sure your employees actually know what's required of them. And so you want to think about who should get trained. You train every single employee, every secretary, assistant, bookkeeper, on and on and on. Who do you want to train? You want to think about how do you want to train them. Are you going to host in-person training sessions? Are you going to do it online? You want to make and there are actually some excellent tools for training out there. One issue that sometimes should come up is making sure that you're training people in their native language if they're not strong English speakers. I believe it or not, I've seen this issue. You want to make sure you pay attention to that. You want to make sure that it's not just you do an ethics code in 2017 it's great. You do training in 2017, and then it just sits. You want to make sure that there are refreshers and training for new people who come aboard, and you want to document the training. If you trained, Jane Doe about FCPA compliance on June 17th, 2017, you want to make sure there is a record in the file that you did that and that she participated, because if Jane Doe then on, June 25th, 2017, makes or arranges or offers an improper payment, at least the organization, at least you, can take some comfort knowing that you trained her, you did what you could to prevent the issue. Once all the training is done, once the code is written, you also want to audit periodically to make sure that it's working. Have a periodic audit, have it be random, take a look for red flags, and if you see them, you want to follow up. When you're doing a merger or an acquisition or joint venture or getting a new trading partner, you want to make sure you're doing due diligence, because those are often the kinds of situations that wind up getting you and your people and your company in trouble, because it's not just payments or offers made by your people that can get you jammed up. It's your trading partners, it's your affiliates, it's your joint venture partners. So before you bring them on board, you want to make sure you do some due diligence as to who they are, what they're up to, what their risk profile is. You want to, make sure you're identifying government-owned entities, whether it's these trading partners or whether it's trading partners that they're dealing with. And there are lots of resources out there. The Department of Commerce has some very good resources. The embassies in the countries in which you're bringing these affiliates and partners on board can be a resource. Local contacts, Google can be helpful, and attorneys and investigators are also resources that you can use to drill down on some of these people. Richard was talking a little bit about his work with law enforcement. If we had more time, it's sometimes interesting to hear more about what he did. I think he is still the longest-serving cooperator in a white-collar criminal investigation in U.S. history. I think that's true. What I will tell you, and you probably may already intuit this from looking at the news, is that our law enforcement agencies are very, very advanced in this area, incredibly advanced, more advanced than you could probably imagine. If there are people in the field in your organization and affiliates who think that they're going to outfox the government and they're relying on that, that is a bad calculus to make. There are vast resources, and our government cooperates extensively with other governments on their investigations. I'm going to be in Brazil next week addressing some of these issues and also giving some talks on this area. There are lots of governments who are working with the U.S. government on anti-bribery issues, and I know it's something that our government has been doing more and more. So when an issue comes up, one of the things you want to do, I suggest that in the area of FCPA, it is usually a good idea to hire counsel. But putting aside the fact that I suppose that's self-serving, what you want to do is, if there's an issue, you want to pay attention to it. Do not ignore it. Do not ignore it. You want to triage it. Figure out, is this something that needs to be dealt with right now, or tonight, or tomorrow morning? what are the issues. You want to sort of size it up and triage it, because you're going to want to act promptly, but you also want to be careful, because when an issue comes up, when there's a red flag, when there's a complaint that comes into the hotline, the clock is ticking, and anybody who touches it, which may be people on this call, is going to be scrutinized. Everything you do is going to be looked at and potentially second-guessed. So you don't want to act rashly. You want to be prompt, but you also want to be careful. And so in looking at potential FCPA issues, you want to be diligent and thorough, but as you've probably noticed if you've read the newspaper, investigations of these kinds of issues can quickly get out of control if they're not handled appropriately. So you can, if you tailor it appropriately, be diligent and thorough so that what you do holds up to scrutiny by law enforcement, but the costs are also controlled. You want to make sure, under all circumstances, that any relevant documents are preserved, because that's something that law enforcement will look very, very closely at. In doing an investigation, one of the things that I always do is figure out where we're going to use inside resources, inside the company meaning, because usually that's less expensive, and where you actually need to use outside investigators or outside lawyers. And that balance, that coordination becomes very important. You want to protect the attorney-client privilege and other privileges. You want to make sure you're not blowing it on local employment and data privacy laws. In some countries, Western Europe and elsewhere, there are very, very stringent employment, human resources, data privacy laws, and you want to make sure that you're very careful on that. And again, you know, a lawyer can help you walk through all these issues. Before I leave you, I want to make sure that I also note that, you know, in addition to the U.S. and the FCPA, which we've spent the afternoon talking about, lots of other countries have their own bribery laws that if you're doing business multinationally, you have to be aware of that fact. So if you're doing business in, you know, Brazil or China or, you know, other places, you want to pay attention to the FCPA. You also want to be aware that there are other bribery laws, some of which are actually even more strict than the U.S. Bribery laws. And for example, the UK bribery law has strict liability. It does not permit those facilitation payments, which were the things early on I said I wasn't going to talk about because they wind up getting people in trouble. And also, in the UK, commercial bribery is clearly a crime. So with that background and setup, I am happy to answer questions. And if you have questions for Richard, I'm sure he can do that also. My contact information is on the screen, so I'm happy to hear from you that way. And Melissa or Jennifer, do you want to remind folks how they can ask questions both verbally and also by typing them out in case they're shy?
Thank you so much, Ross. I appreciate that. If folks want to ask a question on the phone, they can press *1. You can also ask on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can type in a question. So we'll wait for the first audio question. In the meantime, Richard, we did get a question relevant for you, and that is, how did your activity finally come to be prosecuted?
So thank you for the question. And it's very relevant, and particularly in today's environment. So operating in the field for a decade, my very bad behavior hid behind very good performance, right, going back to commercial objectives and variable compensation. So I was successful, and I thought I was safe. What I wasn't counting on was what would happen if one of my intermediaries got caught. And like we see today with so many, even global anti-bribery enforcement actions and investigations, the intermediary was the center, the epicenter of the investigation. So some of you might remember the United Nations Oil for Food investigation. And in the wake of that investigation, the United Nations formed something called the Procurement Task Force, which was chartered with investigating United Nations contract fraud. And an intermediary finds itself being investigated on a food contract, nothing to do with me or my former employer. But I held a defense contract through that same intermediary for armored systems for United Nations peacekeepers on a global basis. It was a rather substantial contract, and one that I referenced before where the UN paid less money due to corruptly obtain information that I conspire to get from a United Nations procurement official. So what happens is the United Nations investigators start seeing my name pop up in their investigation, not on the food, but on the armored systems. So they say, wow, everywhere we look, we see Bistrong's name on emails, on correspondence. What's he up to? So the United Nations investigators turn their attention to me. And that started the ball rolling through my 10 years, literally through the criminal justice system, in that, in part due to that information shared by the United Nations with my former employer, I get dismissed. But I would also come to find out that the current UN investigator at the time was a former Department of Justice prosecutor, in fact, right here in Connecticut. So he turned the findings of his investigation over to the Department of Justice, and 3 months after I was terminated from my former employer, and in part due to that United Nations information, I find myself the target of a criminal investigation for violating the FCPA by the Department of Justice. So my attorney then gets the call from the Department of Justice that I'm the target, and I think as Ross referenced before, that ended up in 5 years of law enforcement cooperation, 3 years as an undercover cooperator with the FBI, and also to pivot to something that Ross said before, this is not just a U.S. law, this is a global enforcement issue. So I wasn't thinking about getting caught in the United States. What about when I was living in the United Kingdom? Well, I find myself the target of a criminal investigation in the UN as a result of similar conduct that occurred when I was there. So I also end up as an undercover cooperator for the City of London Police and found myself in an immunity negotiation with the Crown Prosecution Service. And just go also back to something that Ross talked about, these investigations, these issues take a long time. I was targeted by the Justice Department in 2007, and my probation just terminated in 2017. So this was a 10-year journey through the criminal justice system. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. And Jennifer, have we had any questions come in over the audio queue?
We do have one question in the audio queue. Catherine Nickerson, your line is open.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you both for the presentations. Mr. Garber sort of answered my question already. I was going to ask it right after Mr. Bistrong's presentation, but how have you seen the effect, or have you been able to see effects from the work that we've done on the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention? You've talked a lot about how other countries have laws and cooperation, but particularly in the field, have you seen a real effect? Thank you.
Yes. The answer is absolutely. There's been, I think, a tremendous ramping up of U.S. cooperation with other countries. In fact, I just saw something today about the number of investigations that the U.S. and Brazil, for example, are cooperating on. Currently, it's very, very significant. So So yes, compared to I think 10 years ago, there's been much more cooperation from what I've seen.
And Richard, we have another question for you, which you may or may not be able to answer, and that is, how did the Department of State approve an export license to the island in the Caribbean if that particular government had no legitimate defense purpose?
So I'm a little bit out of my core competency here, but the end user certificate for the order was for either the police or military. It had the proper stamps and the proper paperwork that's necessary for, like, I think back then, I don't know if it still is, the DSP 83. I'm not sure in their review process if the State Department, how highly they scrutinize orders for how well they might make sense in their operating environment. So that would be more of like a DDTC question. But what I remember quite clearly is ultimately that order was licensed because it was an ITAR munitions. It's just difficult for me to ascertain which one of the State Department desks might have asked that question, but they didn't on that order.
Thanks, Richard. Jennifer, any other questions in the queue?
There are no further questions in the queue at this time.
With that, I'd like to thank Ross Garber and Richard Bistrong again. Appreciate you both lending us your expertise, and certainly this was an interesting discussion on the FCPA. Just as a reminder to everyone, you will be getting the net replay of this webinar within 24 hours. So with that, I'll turn it back to Richard and Ross if either of you or both of you have any closing thoughts.
It's Ross. I just want to say, thank you, Melissa, to you and the Department of Commerce, and thanks to everybody for hanging in and participating in this.
This is Richard, and I would just echo Ross's sentiments. Thank you to Melissa and to the Commercial Service for inviting us, and for the attendees for your attention during this session. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again to you both, and have a nice afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for your participation. You may disconnect at this time.